Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Monday night meeting of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. This is part of our regular fortnightly discussions on world events. As internationalists, tonight we're discussing events in South Korea at the end of last year when there was an attempted military coup. I'm not going to go into the details of that because our guest speaker, Dr. Owen Miller, is going to be introducing the subject for about 30 minutes, going into a bit of history and a bit of recent development. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome. Thank you very much for attending. We hope you enjoy the meeting and the discussion. If you're watching this on YouTube, please press the subscribe button and the like button, and that will make sure that you get informed about all the other material that we put on YouTube. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to get Dr. Owen Miller to introduce the discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions and contributions. When we're discussing an international subject, and this is perhaps even more niche or unusual than some of the others, we don't get a lot of contributions, but please do ask questions because we've got an expert here to deal with it. Owen is a lecturer at SOAS. He's going to give us a bit more information about him. I think he's the chair of Korean studies there and specializes in history and economics and state institutions in Korea. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Owen to introduce the discussion with his talk for about 30 minutes. So Owen, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for introducing me. I don't really have much to add to that. Yes, I've been a lecturer at SOAS for about 14 years now, I think, and did my PhD there before. I've also spent time living in South Korea. And my interest is in modern history. And well, I suppose I'll tell you what I'm doing right now, which is not really related to what I'm going to talk about, but I am working on a book about North Korea, about sort of social history of North Korea, mainly in the sort of 30s to the 60s, really, from the colonial period to the period of the era of Kim Il-sung. Anyway, that, as we said, is a different topic, which I won't be talking about now. So yes, I'm going to talk about what's going on in South Korea. And I think I told Nick earlier today that I was going to sort of divide it into two parts and talk about a sort of a brief history of South Korea and South Korean politics in the 20th century into the 21st century. Then I was going to talk about what happened recently. I've ended up dividing it into three sections, so this is why it might take me a little longer than I thought. And I've added to those two things I've mentioned, I've added a sort of a bit at the end about what is the kind of wider political landscape of South Korea today, like, what's going on the right of South Korean politics, what's going on the left of South Korean politics, to give a bit more of the context. I suppose as a disclaimer, I would say, yes, I'm a historian. I've spent time living in Korea. I know lots of Koreans, and I have Koreans who are activists and on the left and socialists and so on. But here comes the but. I haven't been living in Korea recently. I'm not on the ground, and I'm not sort of following all the ins and outs of what's going on a day-to-day basis. And I can't say much about what, the movement, the sort of movement on the left, the social movement against the coup. I can't say much exactly about what's going on with all that because I don't have my ear to the ground, sort of thing. So it will be a bit of a, from more of a distance sort of view. Okay, so yeah, so I thought, since probably quite a few people don't know that much about South Korea's history, I'll start with a bit of a history overview. And of course, as with all these things, you never know quite how far back to go or how much detail to go into. So I'm going to hope that I've got it about right in terms of the level of detail and so on. But I'm just going to give a sort of speed run through 20th century South Korea. So you get a sense, hopefully, I guess people, you're not going to remember all this stuff. It doesn't matter. It just gives you a sense of what a kind of tumultuous history it's had and how much of a role, the masses, for want of a better term, of South Korea, how much of a role they've had in shaping its politics and constantly trying to resist, right wing and dictatorship governments. So, I mean, I would start the story late 19th century when South Korea basically, well, not South Korea, sorry, we're talking about Korea at this time before the division. Korea sort of became a bit of a conflict point between imperialist powers, and it had been an independent kingdom for many centuries prior to that, but in the late 19th century, it was very much weakened and was being basically sort of fought over by Japan, China to some extent, and Russia. But the main fight in the end was between Russia and Japan for control of the Korean Peninsula. Japan won that, as people may know. There was the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, which was the sort of main proximate cause of the First Russian Revolution. And as a result of that war, Japan basically gained the Korean Peninsula, and it made it into a formal colony of Japan in 1910. And then Korea was under colonial rule for 35 years until Japan's defeat in the Second World War, in the Pacific War, by the US. So I'm gonna skip right over the colonial period. Of course, it's important to understanding modern Korean history, but I don't have the space to go into it all here. People can ask about it if they want. So, I mean, I think the key thing I want to sort of get across is how South and North Korea were set up in 1945, because that is still very important for understanding the politics of the two countries. How were they? At the same moment in 1945, in August 1945, they were liberated from Japanese colonial rule, but immediately reoccupied by the two emergent superpowers, the Russians, the Soviets occupying the north, and the Americans occupying the south. This was an agreement made between the two sides. It was the Americans that suggested the partition. Just prior to Japan's surrender, they suggested it to Stalin, and Stalin accepted it. So it was partitioned. It was never supposed to be a permanent partition, but of course the Cold War kicked off in the ensuing years, 1946, 47, the Truman Doctrine, and so on, and it very rapidly became a permanent division of the country. Obviously, much against the wishes and expectations of all Koreans, who had absolutely no say, no idea, nothing to do with the partition whatsoever. It was entirely imposed upon them by the Americans and to an extent the Soviets. Anyway, in that period, 1945 to 50, you have the emergence then of anti-communism as the sort of leading doctrine, the leading ideology in South Korea, and the emergence of a pro-American leader, Syngman Rhee. People may have heard of him. He was basically the first dictator of South Korea. The North and South Korea as countries were founded in 1948 as separate countries. And Syngman Rhee remained basically the dictator and really quite a brutal dictator all through the Korean War, which broke out in 1950, and then up until 1960. And in 1960, South Korea had its first revolution. I would say it's had really probably, you could say, two revolutions in its history. When I say revolutions, I'm talking about political revolutions in which the existing regime was overthrown. They were not substantially social revolutions, but I think nonetheless it's right. I feel it's right to call them revolutions. So in 1960, Syngman Rhee's hated dictatorship was overthrown, replaced with a new constitutional government. However, that was not to last very long because the following year in 1961 there was a coup, military coup. This is, one of the things that the current events sort of echo 1961, and people feel very, incredibly scared by this event because they, people who are alive today have lived through this kind of thing before. So there was a military coup in 1961, and a military strongman, a general called Park Chung-hee, took over, and he ruled until 1979, when he was actually assassinated in a kind of internal, what you might call like a palace dispute, really, by his intelligence chief. So through those years, 1960s, 1970s, up to 1979, people may know this is the period of the kind of, you know, Korean miracle, I suppose people like to call it. It was the period during which there was this very rapid development on the basis of kind of authoritarian state-led development. And it was a brutal regime. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but there were, it was every bit as brutal as, say, I don't know, the South American dictatorships like Argentina or Chile or whatever. Um, then after 1979, basically another military strongman, one of Park Chung-hee's proteges, a man called Chon Do-han, took over, and the military dictatorship continued until 1987. But what's important here is that in 1980 there was a very major uprising in South Korea in a city called Gwangju. People may have heard of this. It was a pro-democracy uprising which became sort of instantly radicalized beyond just being a pro-democracy uprising because it was attacked by special forces troops, by paratroopers, who came and brutalized and killed lots of people. And as a result of that, the whole town rose up against the state and the military and took over the town and forced the military out for about 10 days. It was defeated in the end, but during the 1980s, really, the democracy movement in South Korea really took off. And this eventually led to a mass kind of uprising centered in the capital in Seoul in 1987. That I would say is kind of the second big political revolution of South Korea's history. So 1987, this people's uprising overthrew the military dictatorship and brought back direct presidential elections. So that was the beginning of democratization. I mean, the thing about it is that, I guess maybe this is obvious to say this, but when formal democratic institutions are reinstated, that doesn't mean that the task of installing liberal democracy is over, right? Because all the forces that were there under the dictatorship are still there. All their interests and so on are still there. So it's been I would say since 1987 in South Korea, it's been an ongoing struggle. There's been on the one side, civil society and sort of quite liberal bourgeois forces, but also more radical forces have been fighting to kind of keep and preserve and extend those democratic gains. But on the other side, you've had more forces linked to the old authoritarian regimes, big capital and so on, that wants to roll back a lot of those democratic gains. So what's happened most recently with Yoon Suk Yeol, the current president, who's in the process of being impeached, is part it's part of that story of this push and pull back and forth. It's a very but it's quite an extreme version. It's quite an extreme version of that, to be honest with you. It's quite an unprecedented for there to be such a pushback against democratic gains since 1987. There's never been another coup attempt. There hasn't been another coup attempt since 1987. What else to say? I mean, since 1987, you saw, particularly in the early 1990s, the burgeoning of a really mass workers' movement, democratic union movement, which really grew huge and effectively was able to completely change the working pay and conditions of Korean workers, right? So that industrial workers in Korea had their sort of whole salaries and everything upgraded within the space of a few years, with big pay increases and so on. So it kind of really changed. It changed South Korean capitalism really, and sort of shifted it towards a more consumption economy basically. At the same time, though, in the 1990s, you also had South Korea kind of going with the global shift towards neoliberalism, towards globalization. And then you had at the end of the 1990s, in 1997, you had the Asian financial crisis, which really hit South Korea hard. And since then, in the 21st century, there's been quite a big shift in the nature of South Korean society, in the sense that it's shifted from being that very much developmental state, state-led growth, full employment, all this kind of stuff, to being a sort of ultra neoliberal, ultra competitive society, relatively low growth now. Long gone are the days when it was having like 10, 12% growth a year. Now it's sort of similar to Britain, low levels of growth, very, very high competition society. Everyone is a very much a kind of cutthroat society. I mean, I could talk about that in the discussion, why that is. And of course, one of the features of all this, which people may know about, is that South Korea has become a sort of world leader in declining birth rates, if you want to call it a world leader. I mean, it has now, incredibly low birth rates to the extent that the population is now actually shrinking. And, they reckon by 20, what's it going to be, 2100 or whatever, it's going to be, like the population will be half the size it is now if it carries on the way it's going. And at the same time, I guess in the last sort of 15 years, in terms of politics, I think you've probably seen what's happening in quite a lot of countries, which is a sort of decomposition of classic liberal bourgeois politics. It's sort of various kinds of strange phenomena and odd. I mean, we're seeing this everywhere, right? We're seeing these kind of demagogic characters far right. We're seeing, so an early sort of example of that was the election of a president in 2013 called Park Geun-hye, and she was the first female president of South Korea, but at the same time, she is also the daughter of the dictator Park Chung-hee. So it represented really a sort of nostalgic turn of people back towards the former authoritarian rule of the past. She was then thrown out by impeachment in 2017 after massive street protests. So once again, people came onto the streets to defend democracy in the face of her kind of attacks, and successfully, because she was impeached and thrown out. And this is often referred to in South Korea, these events in 2016-17 as the candlelight revolution, because people carried candles at these demonstrations, and they became a kind of a symbol of the movement against Park Geun-hye's government. I personally have a bit of a thing with calling it candlelight revolution because I think compared to the previous cases in South Korean history, I don't see this as much of a revolution. In a key way, it didn't really make a massive change in South Korean politics. This is my opinion. I mean, maybe other people might disagree with this, but there was no attempt after this to make any constitutional changes. There was no real change to the party system. So essentially, you just return back to this kind of alternating system. And what South Korea has now in terms of mainstream politics looks quite like US politics, or to some extent like British politics, where you have that alternation between a sort of right-wing conservative bourgeois party and a sort of centre-right or centre-left, depending on how you look at it, bourgeois party. But it's probably more like the US one. You have Democrat in South Korea. You have the Conservative Party and you have a Democratic Party. There's no mainstream party that has any roots or basis in labor, like in workers, right? So in that sense, they don't have a Labour Party. So yes, it's kind of returned to that alternation. And so since Park Geun-hye, you then had a liberal president called Moon Jae-in for 5 years, and then in 2022, you had the election of this current conservative president Yoon Suk Yeol, who was narrowly elected in May 2022. And so therefore now is just sort of past halfway, well, maybe almost past halfway through his presidency. Okay, so I'm going to say a bit about what's been happening recently. Yoon was elected very narrowly. He's a former prosecutor. There's a lot of overlap in South Korean politics between the prosecution. So that's like I don't know, what's the British equivalent of that? That's Nick will be able to say what it is, but
Crown Prosecution Service.
Crown Prosecution Service, yeah. So, but in Korea, it's I guess a bit more like the US or France, where these people they have a lot of investigative powers and they lead whole investigations and yeah, you understand what I mean. They're sort of they're more powerful, I think, than they are here. So they can have a lot of political power as well, because they can make or break politicians, they can take down politicians, and so on. And there's now this overlap where quite a lot of prosecutors then move into politics as well. But yeah, I guess that's not entirely different from this country. Um, yeah, he was pretty unpopular from early on. The South Korean economy has been struggling a bit. He hasn't had any solutions for that. There was this terrible disaster of this stampede in Itaewon in autumn of 2022, which the way his government dealt with that was quite made him quite more unpopular. Anyway, so he has struggled with his agenda. I should say that his election itself was quite disturbing because he I don't know whether he is himself a kind of natural sort of fascist or anything, but he obviously in his election took on certain kinds of quite far right talking points and areas because he felt that he could you know, he could build a base on that. And so one of the things was misogynism. Very clearly, he appealed to misogynist sort of, strands within South Korean society. I'll come back to that at the end. And he built popularity among young men, young sort of right-wing leaning men. And also the other thing he's leaned into is sinophobia, so like anti-Chinese feeling in South Korea. Anyway, going back to what's been happening. So yeah, then April last year there were the legislative elections for the National Assembly. So they have a system again. It's a bit like the US. You have a presidential election, and then a couple of years later you have a legislative election. So it tends to create this situation. I guess maybe France is similar as well, where you can often have oppositional, president and a National Assembly which are completely at loggerheads with one another. And it quite often creates a situation where the president becomes a lame duck for the last couple of years of their time in power. And that's exactly what's happened with Yoon, really. He was decisively defeated by the Democratic Party in the National Assembly election last year. And that's really the beginning of his coup plot, because at that point, he clearly has some personality issues in addition to his politics. He just, I suspect I don't know. I suspect he's probably a narcissist like Trump, and he's got those kind of leanings. But anyway, he just couldn't contemplate the fact that he was going to be a lame duck. And he began to put in place plans to overturn the legislature in what I guess it's a classic type of self coup, right, or administrative coup. Um, um, Having said that, when this event happened, so this martial law declaration, which I'm referring to it as a coup, definitely as a coup, or attempted coup, happened on the night of December the 3rd, 4th, last year. It was a really big surprise for people in Korea. It was a really big surprise for me. I had no inkling that something like this was going to happen. People were just absolutely shocked, taken aback, and found it quite incredible to think that something like this could happen in 21st century Korea, so what are we, we're like, 45, we're getting on, 40 something years after, well, not quite 40, nearly 40 years after the transition to democracy. People couldn't believe it. Having said that, there were a small number of opposition lawmakers who had been predicting it, and they were proved to be right. So this martial law coup unfolded on that evening of December the 3rd. The President Yoon made a televised address and said that he was declaring martial law to deal with these sort of what he's calling anti-state forces or pro-North Korean forces. This is where North Korea does come into it, because right-wing governments in South Korea always use Red Scare tactics. I mean, it's so it's just everyone knows. I mean, it's almost, people just almost shrug their shoulders at it because it's been, it's so much part of the playbook that they use Red Scare tactics. So he said he was doing it, obviously to save the country. And he then sent in these special forces troops to various locations. The main locations that he sent them to were the National Assembly, obviously, because basically he wanted to overturn the National Assembly. And then also the National Electoral Commission. The reason he sent soldiers to the National Electoral Commission is because he was wanting. He's basically quite obsessed with lots of right-wing conspiracies and right-wing YouTubers. And lots of them had been talking about the idea that the National Assembly elections had been interfered with and were, not, were corrupt and so on. And so he wanted to go into the National Electoral Commission and sort of either find or plant evidence for this. Um, anyway, it all went wrong for him because, well, there's a number of reasons it went wrong. But basically, what happened was that he sent police, first of all, to seal off the National Assembly, but the police didn't do a good job of it, probably felt uncomfortable about it. And the lawmakers, when they heard of this coup attempt, basically streamed back to the National Assembly and got in, even climbing over the fences and so on to get into the National Assembly. Um, and then when finally the special forces troops did arrive, they were very hesitant about actually going in and following the president's orders, which were to drag out, tie up, and arrest all of the opposition lawmakers. Anyway, this level of hesitation basically meant that the National Assembly was able to convene with a quorate number of lawmakers, and they were able to vote down the martial law, which is their prerogative to do so. They can, by a majority vote, they can vote down martial law. And they did that. And eventually, in the early hours of the morning, I don't know, about 4 o'clock in the morning or something, Yoon Suk Yeol eventually gave in and said that he would withdraw the martial law. So the coup was defeated basically because, I mean, partly the military, quite a lot of the military were not really prepared to go through with it. I mean, it's a long time since Korea was a military dictatorship, and I guess the whole role of the military in Korean society is quite different now. Yoon had assumed that they would just follow his orders, but it seems as though the lower officers and the ordinary soldiers on the ground were not really willing to go through with the orders. I'll just show you this image. Let's have a look. I can't see if I can find this now. Oh, that's annoying. It's not showing up. Hang on. Hang on. Maybe if I can bring it onto the same screen, it'll let me do it. Sorry, so the mysteries of sharing on Zoom. Here we go. So hopefully you can see this image. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was one of the scenes that unfolded outside the National Assembly when, hundreds of citizens arrived there to defend it. All the staff who were working in the assembly came out to defend it. And there were all these scuffles going on around the National Assembly. It was incredibly moving and exciting to watch at the time. And this particular image is a woman called An Qui-ryong. She works for the Democratic Party, the opposition party. And she confronted one of these special forces soldiers outside and grabbed his gun. You can see on the left of the image here that she's grabbed the muzzle of this guy's automatic rifle and was shouting at him and so on. And these soldiers basically faced with this situation of ordinary citizens and lawmakers and so on, just physically confronting them, even though they were heavily armed with, heavy weapons and so on. This really kind of paralyzed the soldiers, I think, to quite a large extent. I mean, they did go into the National Assembly. They were going to try and arrest the lawmakers, so on, but basically in the end they retreated. I think even before, well before Yoon Suk Yeol had actually declared martial law over, they retreated. So I'll just stop sharing that. Yeah, I mean, I think they also Yoon Suk Yeol underestimated the extent to which ordinary people were going to come out onto the streets to defend democracy. He hadn't really thought about that aspect of it, and actually ordinary people did play a big role. Even in the middle of the night, thousands of people came out to the National Assembly, physically put themselves in the way to prevent the armored personnel carriers reaching the assembly and so on. Um, and on top of that, like a lot of leaders, particularly I think narcissistic and sort of psychopathic leaders like this, they make really stupid mistakes. I think they overlook really obvious things. I mean, they didn't get, for example, they didn't get proper air clearance for the Black Hawk helicopters carrying the special forces into the National Assembly. So the Air Force prevented them from actually overflying Seoul in order to reach the National Assembly, which I think is kind of hilarious that, it was basically their own idiocy. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, there were various other basic sort of mistakes that they made. And the outcome, of course, was that the coup was overturned. I mean, however, that was not the end of the crisis. The crisis is actually still ongoing. I won't go into all the details of exactly everything that's happened since then. But ultimately, the National Assembly voted to impeach Yoon Suk Yeol, as you might expect. That impeachment has now gone to the Constitutional Court, where the judges in the Constitutional Court have heard. They've now finished hearing the impeachment trial, and that we're now waiting for the decision from them, which probably will be this week. But it seems to be getting delayed and delayed, so people are suspicious about what is going on. Of course, if they clear him, he will go straight back to office. He's suspended at the moment, but he'll go straight back to office. Um, at the same time, there has been, I think, multiple criminal investigations into this, and he is under investigation for treason or insurrection, depending on how you translate the charge. But this is the only crime that a sitting president can actually be prosecuted for under the South Korean constitution. But it's also, of course, in any country, I guess it's one of the highest possible crimes anyone can be charged with. And there's a huge amount of evidence. I mean, just, all of these various people have come forward and given their evidence. Even all his previous sort of lieutenants have really spilled the beans. So he's pretty bang to rights, but I don't know. This is a political issue, and it's not entirely clear which way it will go at the moment. He had been arrested in January. I don't know whether people saw there was this big controversy about whether he could be arrested or not because his presidential guard were defending him, holed up in his presidential residence. And in the end, there was worries that there might be violence when they went to arrest him. In the end, they did arrest him. Then a couple of weeks ago, a district court overturned his arrest, and he's been released again. So it's there's lots of ups and downs. It's not a smooth process. But currently we're waiting for the decision of the Constitutional Court. I mean, I've always felt all along that surely they are going to impeach him because the evidence is just so incredibly strong. And his defense in the Constitutional Court trial was really just sophistry and lies, and I mean, very obvious. I mean, he even lies to the extent he would just keep contradicting himself and so on. Having said that, I'm not 100% sure. We live in this strange world now where nothing's predictable anymore, it feels to me. Who knows? Now, I'm probably already in danger of going a bit over time, but I just wanted to finish by saying something about the sort of political landscape. Shall I do that, Nick, or do you want me
Yeah,
to?
you carry on.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I'll say something about the right in South Korea. Who is the right? I mean, because Yoon Suk Yeol's coup attempt, so on, is not happening in a vacuum. It's not even like the old days of authoritarian politics, really, because he does have a base, he does have a following, he does have people who are coming out onto the streets in quite large numbers, thousands, to support him. Nowhere near as big as the pro-democracy protests, nowhere near as big, but still worryingly big. So one of the main constituencies supporting the far right and this president in South Korea is a retired generation of people over 65. They're often evangelical Christians. They're very socially conservative, very like anti-LGBT so on. And they tend to get their news from far right YouTubers. There's this famous pastor called John Kwang Hoon, but there's various other. I mean, these people literally spend hours and hours of a day. I mean, I know people whose parents are like this, so I've talked to them. They spend hours and hours a day watching YouTube, far right YouTube people full of conspiracy theories, anti-Chinese conspiracies, misogyny, and so on. And they tend to believe in conspiracies, that the country is either being taken over by the Chinese, by the CCP, or it's being taken over by pro-North Korean forces or the far left or something like that. So another constituency of Yoon Suk Yeol and the far right is this sort of new one of young misogynistic men or right-wing men who feel kind of deeply dissatisfied with South Korean society, with its ultra-competitive kind of winner-loser kind of culture. And I guess with their perceived loss of male privileges, which I guess, South Korea has had a pretty rapid transition from being a very traditionalist Confucian patriarchal society to being a kind of neoliberal individualistic society. In that process, it's not that men have lost all their privileges at all. Men are it's still absolutely a patriarchal society. But even just the perceived loss of some privileges seems to be enough to motivate these men. They also tend to be strongly anti-Chinese as well. Another part of the far right is evangelical Christian churches, which are massive in South Korea. You've seen the same kind of thing in South America, right? I think the right in South America is now very much kind of constituted through Protestant evangelical churches. The same thing in South Korea. And these churches are very, as I understand it, are pretty closely linked to right-wing Protestantism in the US as well. And they're a huge organizing force. They get lots of people out onto the streets. The far right also has a kind of intellectual base in South Korea around something called the New Right movement, which I won't go into right now. I can talk about that if you want. I would just as a sort of anecdotal thing. I remember when I lived in South Korea 25 years ago. That's the last time I lived there. I've been there for months at a time since then, but that's the last time I lived there for any substantial time was in 2001. I found it fascinating that, in a way, having come from the UK, where in the 1990s we were actually on the streets, facing down fascists and the BNP and so on. Being in South Korea, there was no fascist movement that I could, there was nothing like that there. And I found I found it fascinating. In a certain sense, I sort of attributed that to the fact that the authoritarian state, the anti-communist authoritarian state, had kind of monopolized right-wing ideas in South Korea, and there wasn't really a space for a fascist movement. But that is different now. I think there very much is a space for a fascist movement, and I think the far right in South Korea is a sort of nascent fascism, particularly with the xenophobic element. Okay, and finally, I was going to talk about the left. Try and keep this brief. I mean, the main opposition party in South Korea is not a left-wing party. The Democratic Party descends from the democratic opposition of the dictatorship days, but it does not have any working class base. It's much more like the US Democrats. And there have been long-running attempts to form a sort of social democratic party or a Labour Party in South Korea. The most successful incarnation of that was probably about 20 years ago. You had this thing called the Korean Democratic Labour Party, which ultimately broke up into various parts. More recently, the main left electoral party in the National Assembly is called the Justice Party. But recently it's really been hit quite badly. It went into an alliance with the Green Party in South Korea. I would say its politics are probably centrist, maybe whether you could call it reformist, I don't know, but it's maybe a little bit to the left of our Labour Party. There's also still quite a vibrant pro-democracy civil society in South Korea, like a non-party social movement left, I suppose, with big organizations like there's one called PSPD. They can get masses of people out onto the streets, and they help to build these huge pro-democracy rallies, which can be over 1 million people. Then there's the radical left. I mean, the radical left is small, just as divided as it is in the UK, I would say. The big difference in South Korea is that there's like a really long-running rift on the left between those people who sort of more pro-North Korean left and then the non-pro North Korean left. The SWP has a sister organization in South Korea, which is currently called Workers' Solidarity, and they're fairly effective, but they've been involved in a lot of controversies over recent years, and they've become quite a bit of a pariah on the left, which maybe sounds familiar. Um, well, organized labor in Korea. Organized labor in Korea, I mean, the unions can be still quite, very quite radical in their approach, and they're not shy of getting involved in politics. They can, they'll call general strikes and so on. But their actual ability to impact national politics is relatively limited because union density is pretty low in South Korea. So they're quite radical, but they're not that powerful, if you know what I mean. And I think one of the biggest things of the last 20 years in South Korea has been the really radical, well, really significant decline of the student movement. The student movement was absolutely the backbone of the left in South Korea, very radical, very prepared to go out on the streets, fight the police, do whatever was necessary, be sent to jail, all kinds of things. But that student politics has really just, from my view at least, it's just dissipated really, which is quite quite worrying in a way because I think it sort of means that there isn't, although you can have these big pro-democracy mass movements and people coming onto the streets, there isn't any organizational kind of backbone to it. In the student movement, in the labor movement, it tends to just sort of blow up into a big thing, and then as it happened in 2017 with the last time round, it just sort of disappears completely, and you then have another kind of centrist government, which is probably, if I was to bet on it, that is probably what's going to happen. There will be elections in a couple of months' time, and there will be then the Democratic Party will be elected. There'll be another kind of centrist sort of democratic government, which will be moderately better in certain ways than Yoon Suk Yeol's government, but it will then lead to another round of, well, there'll probably be another right-wing government in a few years. I'll stop there because I've obviously spoken for a bit too long, but
Owen, thank you very much indeed. A fascinating roundup and review of what's going on in a country that probably most of us, perhaps all of us, don't really pay too much attention. Maybe vaguely aware of what went on recently. That's why I gave you quite a bit more time so that you could fill in all the gaps. We obviously, as internationalists, think it's important to follow international events and look at class struggle elsewhere. What I'm going to do now is open it up for contributions, and perhaps it'll be more the case of questions. Those of you who attend regularly will know that we try to limit contributions in the first instance to 3 minutes so that everybody gets a go. But let's see how it goes. I'm sure there must be questions, and as we always say, there are no silly questions because the questions, the answers illuminate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call in Edmund, followed by Ian.
Thanks very much, Owen, for that introduction. It was really fascinating. I wanted to just see what you thought about uh, one issue, which I guess is ironically one of the sort of bugbears of the young misogynistic men that you were telling us about. And that's the fact that, of course, there's still universal military service in South Korea. And so young men consistently have to go and do their military service. And that is obviously in contrast, for the moment anyway, to the situation we have in the UK, where we have quite a small professional army. And so I just wondered what you thought about that in terms of the impact on the place of the military in society and the political, um, whether there's an effect of, I guess, solidifying support or acquiescence for the military as a sort of reactionary bulwark in society. Whether on the flip side, potentially there's also a dynamic in crisis points like this where conscript soldiers who might be called out in a situation like this are reluctant to turn their guns on people who are obviously just kind of the man on the street or the woman on the street who may be their friends and neighbours, that kind of thing. So I was just wondering what you thought about that, and has that changed in South Korea in recent decades? Bourgeois democracy as opposed to the dictatorship years.
Thanks, Ed. Ian.
All right, I'd just like to ask about how this Yoon Suk Yeol situation impacts the inter-Korean relationships, especially, and also the sort of new Cold War that especially Biden, but in slightly different strategies, Trump is promoting in the area. I saw at the start of last year, North Korea was coming out with a new policy to sort of repudiate reunification, call South Korea unfriendly foreign country for the first time. And that was partly because Yoon Suk Yeol had been such an incredibly pro-American, aggressive president. And if it turns out, as it hopefully probably will, the Supreme Court that he is here today, gone tomorrow, bourgeois politician, does that mean that they've jumped the gun and could roll that back quite quickly? Or, given what you were saying about we'll have another conservative president most likely as the cycle goes on, I think that they might even feel that they've got a point, given that. I think the current lead Democrat Party candidate didn't go into that. I follow some South Korean stuff. Seems to be a very corrupt guy, or certainly a very controversial guy himself. Was also used to emulate Bernie Sanders, but he's become a lot more right wing in the last few years. So yeah, with that on the horizon, how much can we expect to change? I do know as well, Yoon, during the coup, also tried to pick a fight with North Korea, I heard, but they didn't oblige, didn't give him that excuse. And also the main target, of course, is China. And now we've got Trump. He obviously, last time he was in, did try and make some kind of a deal with Kim Jong-un that got further than people might have expected, but then stalled. And there's been speculation that might happen again. So in terms of that, it's interesting times. So how will all this affect that sort of geopolitical side of things? Because it's like on a hamster wheel, it seems, right now between the two parties in South Korea, but geopolitically a lot of stuff going on in the area around it. And the unresolved issue of, I mean, just to wash your hands of reunification for good, there's still families who are divided by it. And you'd hope that before the last of that generation die, they'd at least be able to have more family reunifications. And national reunification, it's hard to see exactly what the mechanism would be, but presumably it's still something that people want in the long run.
Thank you very much, Ian. Minnie?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. I thought it was really interesting. I didn't know much about South Korea or North Korea, really. I know a little bit more now, thank you. Some questions, really. You talked about neoliberalism coming in, and obviously the GDP growth diving to sort of UK sort of equivalent standard. But I'm just wondering, all this obviously in the context of capitalism, which we want to get rid of globally. But how much of the manufacturing has been outsourced? I know you said that the workers had a powerful, they managed to get lots of pay rises and things in the 80s, and that's kind of going down a little bit now. But how much of are they looking to outsource more and more? Because I thought that was one of the workshops of the world, and they do export a lot to the US, don't they? And another question is, what did the US do during that coup, I think it would have been when Biden was basically a lame duck, wasn't he? So that would have been then. But what did they do? The US influence on evangelical churches? Is there a lot of kind of culture sharing going on between the US, I would imagine, and South Korea? Also, have you visited North Korea? And I was just wondering, and could you give us a flavour? I don't know whether you have or not, but you said there's a pro-North Korea movement in South Korea, and there's obviously an against North Korea movement. Could you give us a flavour of those movements, and what is it that the pro-North Korea like about North Korea? That'd be really interesting. And just to say, in the face of the misogyny and rising misogyny globally, obviously in that country, I thought that was a really powerful photograph of that woman averting the gun. All power to her. Thank you.
Thanks, Minnie. Is there anybody else that has got questions for Owen?
Can I come back now, because I'm in danger of just getting a bit overloaded?
Yeah. No, that's great, Owen. I was going to call you back in, so you fire away.
Yeah, so the first thing was about military service, I think, right? Yeah, so I mean that is a really big thing in South Korean society that men do. I believe it's still over 2 years of military service. So if you think about it, I mean it's huge, right? It's a really substantial chunk of your life. And of that particular bit of your life, right? In your usually in late teens, early 20s, lots of men will go to university. They might do 1 or 2 years of university, then they go off and do it, and then they come back and finish university. It really rips apart that bit of their lives, and I think it's completely kind of understandable for men to be very unhappy about that. And obviously, I mean the way to deal with that, should be, I guess, like a mass movement of refusal, or a mass movement against military service. The government has always been very strict in clamping down on any refusal, whether it's conscientious objectors, Jehovah's Witnesses, even religious reasons are not considered. So Jehovah's Witnesses have been quite, we don't usually think of them as being terribly persecuted, I suppose, but they have been quite persecuted in South Korea for refusing military service. So yeah, I mean, yes, it's a minefield in a way, because this is something that some of these young misogynist men, or incel men, or whatever you want to call them, do cite. Because they say, well, we lose this 2 years of our life, women don't lose this. They then get a 2 year head start into the job market, and by the time we get there, we can't get these jobs that we want because women have already taken them. It is true that women have made advances in the workforce in South Korea, particularly into sort of middle or lower or middle levels in white collar work. But you go up a bit higher, you'll see there's almost no women. I mean, it's incredibly male dominated society once you get above like the sort of middling levels. Yeah, so I mean, there are real issues there, like around military service, and the thing about whether soldiers will fight and so on. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, of course, in this case, what they planned to do with taking over the National Assembly and other sites was they used special forces troops, and they used them because I guess, simply because they are considered the most crack troops and the most trustworthy troops and the ones who will obey. So I think they sent 4 different regiments or battalions or whatever of special forces troops. One of them are the Special Warfare Command. Those are the troops who are specifically trained to infiltrate North Korea and carry out assassination and sabotage missions within North Korea. Other ones included the Capital Defense Command, which is a special crack unit to defend the capital, as you might expect. Various other ones, but they were all very specialized soldiers. Interesting thing is that even those special forces soldiers were not quite prepared to follow what they're being told to do. I mean, they followed up to a point, but they weren't going to fire on fellow citizens. They weren't going to go in. They didn't really seem to want to go in and drag out the lawmakers and arrest them. So, yeah, that's interesting. what was the other thing? Oh yeah, so the other question was about inter-Korean relations. Yeah. So I mean, North Korea has shifted its position quite radically last year in saying that it's not really pursuing reunification, that it sees South Korea as an enemy. This is quite a big shift. It's partly because Yoon Suk Yeol was pretty hostile, but I think it's not just that. I think it's the changing geopolitics of the situation. I think it's the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power. It considers itself a nuclear power. It has nuclear weapons, and it's not going to get rid of them. And South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons, so it's reassessed its own kind of position in relation to South Korea, I think, and it's much more confident. And also, I guess there's this new alignment between North Korea and Russia, which is another factor in this whole thing. North Korea is sort of back in the position that it played for a long time during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, which is it was able to stay allied with both China and the Soviet Union. Even when the China and the Soviet Union were practically at war with each other, it would stay allied with both of them and played them off against each other, and was able to really maximize its benefits from the two countries, the two allies. It's almost back in that situation. It now has both China and Russia, and I think North Korea feels itself in a pretty good position, which is why it's not so interested in inter-Korean relations. We'll have to see what happens if there is a sort of more liberal government in power for the next few years. The South Korean government will probably try to reopen kind of talks and some kind of détente with North Korea. But whether North Korea will be interested, I don't know. We'll have to see. I don't think North Korea feels it has that much to gain from South Korea anymore. It has other fish to fry, as it were. So maybe it's not, and I think North Korea feels quite betrayed the last period of détente in which, it had these talks with Trump, these two summits with Trump and various summits with the South Korean leader. And in the end, it got nothing from it. And they feel pissed off about that, I think. So that's another thing. Kim Jong-un feels personally kind of pissed off. That's, I think, another thing behind it. They didn't get any sanctions relief or anything like that. And North Korea is under huge amount. I mean, it's like the most sanctioned country in human history, I think. So, Other questions. Well, there were various questions about capitalist. Oh yeah, what about manufacturing in South Korea? Yeah, I mean it is still a massive manufacturing country, but in the last say 25, 30 years, it's become much more integrated in kind of East Asian value chains or whatever you want to call it. I'm not an economist, but I might be misusing this language. But it's very much integrated so that things are made in Japan and assembled in Korea. Parts are made in China and contribute towards things assembled in, you know what I mean? It's all this kind of very integrated system. And South Korea did start outsourcing a lot of its assembly of stuff. So South Korea now is producing the much higher up the value chain stuff, like the actual semiconductors and so on. And then, stuff is assembled in other countries. And for a long time, it was doing a lot of assembly in China. So Samsung, had loads of smartphone factories and stuff in China. But it's now been, over the last 5 years or so, it's actually been withdrawing from that. So you are seeing a decoupling with China. And South Korea now has a lot of factories in Vietnam. I think probably Thailand as well, other Southeast Asian countries. That's where it's shifted to. But it's still it's still quite integrated. China and South Korea are still quite integrated. So there's this fundamental dilemma that South Korea, and it's had this dilemma for about 20 years now, at least, that it is stuck between the US and China. And it doesn't really know, which way to go. The South Korean ruling class is obviously much more sort of leans towards the US. There's like almost 30,000 US troops in South Korea. It's basically under the US security umbrella, the nuclear umbrella. So, in that sense, its bread is buttered on that side, right, on the American side. But it can't completely extricate it from the Chinese side either. So it's in a real dilemma. Another question was, what did the US do during the coup? I can't really quite remember. I think Biden's administration said something like, the usual kind of bland thing they say, like, we hope that, democratic order is, restored or some such thing. The US has a history of supporting dictators in South Korea, and it has a history of supporting dictators until the very last minute when this happened in 1960 with Syngman Rhee, it happened in 1987 with Chon Doo-hwan. It will support them to the very last minute when it realizes that this person is toast and that there's going to be overthrown by a mass uprising. And then they will say, oh, well, we think it's now time for a democratic transition. And we support the democratic aims of the protesters, sort of thing. So that's happened before. Final thing. Oh yeah, yes, you asked whether I've been to North Korea. Yes, I've been to North Korea a couple of times. I went last time in 2016. I went to a conference at Kim Il-sung University, which, as you might imagine, is the main university. It's the Oxford of North Korea. And yeah, I mean it's a very interesting place. I'm not sure I'd recommend it to everyone for a holiday, even if they do open up to tourism again this year, which they're supposed to do. Certainly, an interesting place if you want to get sort of last flavor of what a kind of Stalinist country might be like. But I mean, I could give a whole different talk about North Korea, but I mean, it is a strange hybrid now where there's lots of rich capitalists basically as well, but they tend to all they're so tied to the state that they kind of hide what's going on a lot of the time. There was a question about the pro-North in South Korea. I mean, yeah, there's still a sort of remnant rump of the old kind of pro-North, pro-Juche sort of left in South Korea. They're not that. I guess nowadays they're not so much openly saying like we want South Korea to be absorbed by North Korea. They're more just sort of being kind of like they're more kind of their slogan tends to be more like peace and unification. They're sort of softer, I guess you would say. Yeah. I think that I won't say any more about that because it's yeah.
Thanks, Owen. I've got Christine's got her hand up. Christine?
Hello, Owen. It's absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you could say more about the position of women in South Korea. I mean, you talked about the plummeting birth rate, but it's a male-dominated society, and you said that women don't do well in higher status jobs. What's the and you said that it's the Christian evangelism is strong. So you would think the family would be something that was supported. So what is actually the cause of the plummeting birth rate? And what, women, I presume, aren't conscripted. Do they serve in the armed forces at all? I'm just puzzled. Could you say more about that, please?
Okay. Owen, I think I read something in the papers over the weekend said that, your point, North Korea's got the lowest birth rate in the world, it seems to suggest.
Well, South Korea has.
South Korea, sorry,
yeah,
South Korea, yeah.
Yeah, 0.7, I think 0.7 live births per woman. Is that how fertility rates are measured? I think that's right, yeah. I think, a sort of healthy birth rate has to be something over 2, right? I think it's 0.7 in I mean, we have a low birth rate already in Britain, but it's nothing like as low as that.
I don't know if you can see in the chat, Ian Drummond has suggested cost of living, but
yeah,
maybe broader issues.
Yeah, I mean, okay, there's a load of issues here. I think, one of the things you have to take into account with South Korea is this sort of compressed modernity, right? I think in Western European countries, we sort of understand our history as having been relatively sort of slow progression from the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century to sort of, modern societies in the late 20th, early 21st century. and we've been through a lot of changes and tumultuous times in that sort of 250-year period. But all of that has kind of happened in South Korea in about 60 years, beginning really in the 1950s, 60s. And so everything's been compressed into this very short space of time. And, that causes all kinds of, that means things are different, right? That means things, it's not like, it's not a simple, straightforward. I mean, there's a famous sort of thing attributed. There's a quote from Marx, isn't there, that like the advanced countries show the backward countries the future image of themselves. But it's not really quite like that, because when countries do develop later and in a more compressed way, it's different actually to some degree. I think. What are the things that have happened? I mean, one of the statistics I always tell my students, which I find fascinating, is that, if you go back to the 1980s or 70s or 80s, one person households are an interesting sort of statistical indicator of a society, right? One person households were sort of a few percent of all households were one person households back in the 80s. Now it's something like 30 or 40% of all households are one person households. So this is a kind of very rapid atomization, a very rapid breakdown, first of all, of the extended family type of arrangement, where you'd have multiple generations under one roof, living in rural areas. People move to the cities absolutely en masse in their millions. Now has a urbanization rate of 80 or 90%. You shift to sort of smaller family units, then you shift to kind of classic sort of nuclear family, and now it's kind of gone beyond that, to be honest. And actually, people are not even forming families. So there's this kind of concept in South Korean society of what they call sampo, which means giving up three things. And basically that's, I think dating, marriage, and having children. But now, like, there's all these other ones, like giving up 5 things, giving up 10 things. They love these kind of lists, So it's like the Chinese have these kind of concepts as well. People just are finding, life is so competitive, so expensive. It's so difficult to get housing. That having a child and having a career just seems like an almost impossible sort of task. I think we see the same sort of things in Britain. I just think it's a little bit more intense in Korea. It's just an intensity to it which you don't quite see here. I don't think there's quite the same generational wealth among middle and upper working class people that you get in this country, which can soften the blow for some people. And there isn't also the same social safety net that exists in this country, which again can soften the blow for some people and allow people to have children. But I think that the social safety net thing is probably the most important thing. I think one of the most instructive things I ever sort of encountered was going to Norway about 15 years ago or 10 years ago or something, going around the supermarket there, and you see all these people in their early 20s with kids in pushchairs, and you're like, wow. Why is that? Of course, because Norway has a decent childcare and social safety net, and people have children in their 20s because they can do. But anyway, in South Korea, it's gone in completely the opposite direction. People are completely giving up on having children. Another major factor is education. Education is sort of semi-privatized in South Korea because there's a state school system, which of course is free, and a state school system. Everyone sends their kids there, but no one believes they can get their kids into the good universities just by going to a state school. So everyone sends everyone is in a kind of arms race to send their children to tutors. Children will be going to tutors from 7 o'clock in the morning and not getting home sometimes until midnight. It's absolutely horrendous. Families spend a huge amount of their monthly income on education if they've got kids, and that's all on this extra, outside of school tutoring. So again, this is another factor that puts people off having kids. If they have kids, they'll have one kid because there's only, you can only really invest in one child if you're spending a very large proportion of your monthly income on that. So, I mean, a metaphor that I use about the university system there is that it's sort of like everyone wants to go to a very small number of universities, and it's kind of like the entire country is rushing towards like 1 or 2 doors, and not everyone's going to be able to get through, but there's this sort of incredible sense of you won't get anywhere in life if you don't get a qualification from one of the top few universities. Yeah, I don't know. Does that help explain some of this? I think just one other thing I would add to that is about the misogyny thing and so on. And I think there is a conscious decision by a lot of women to basically step outside of the patriarchal family child rearing system and just say we don't actually have to do this. So I think that is going on as well. And of course, that in itself is feeding into the misogynistic attitude of young men who are saying, well, women are just abandoning us and they don't want to participate anymore. So there's this sort of, cycle going on.
Okay, Owen, thanks. Anybody else that wants to ask any questions that may have been prompted by what Owen's been saying? Anything else at all? Owen, I've got a few questions, if I may. How much do you see the developments that you've outlined in Korea as being part of a global trend? There seemed to me to be, in what you were saying, exemplars there that we could see repeated around the world, not just the obvious parallels with Trump and Trumpism and right-wing Christian fundamentalism in America, but the growth of, if you like, the young men drifting to the right or moving to the right, fascistic leaders, perhaps without the need for a big fascist base, but clearly growing around the world in different countries, including here in Europe, obviously, as we see. What's the impact in the rest of Asia? I think South Korea is the fourth biggest economy in Asia. Is what happens in South Korea, does that have an impact elsewhere, or is it vice versa, or is it part of a regional trend? And then perhaps a different question, the absence of an organized left or a significant organized left. I mean, again, global trends over the last 40 years have been, I suppose I would say, a retreat of the Marxist, the socialist, the communist left, real communism as opposed to Stalinism, but a retreat of those ideas within society generally. How much, though, in South Korea, with its proximity to China and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, which I would say is not communist at all, and how much is the proximity to North Korea, which is, as you've described it, perhaps the last remnant of a Stalinist society? How much of that does that impact on the weakness of Marxist ideas in South Korea? Because if that's what's perceived as being communism, then we don't want it, if you see the point that I'm trying to make. And am I right in understanding that Marxism or communism is still illegal, at least officially, in South Korea? Anyway, those are some questions.
I'll start with the last bit because I'll now remember it more easily. But well, Marxism, communism, not exactly illegal. I mean, they have what's called a national security law, which dates right from the early days of Syngman Rhee's dictatorship in about 1948-49, which does outlaw any kind of expressions of support for North Korea, or any kind of expressions. It then widened to be any kind of expressions of support for anti-state forces. So you can see that's a very, broad, potentially very broad definition. And in the past, Marxists, communists, socialists of all stripes, many of whom were anti-North Korea, did not support North Korea, have been prosecuted under those laws. And so yeah, it's very much, it is there. But on the other hand, I mean, Marxism itself is not really outlawed. You can publish Marxist books. I mean, I have a friend who's a professor there who's run a Marxist academic journal which I'm on the board of for like the last 20 years. And left-wing Marxist parties can openly publish stuff and organize and so on. Just have to be a bit careful. And of course, it just basically means the state always has an excuse to clamp down if it wants to, right? If it ever feels it needs to, it will do. So that's, yeah, it's um in terms of like the left and the trajectory of the left, and I think one of the sort of, I suppose, the ironic thing for South Korea and South Korean left is that it really rose during the 1980s, during the democracy movement. There was a very strong left wing of the democracy movement. You know, the left in South Korea had been repressed, physically, violently repressed since the 1940s. And you know, really repressed in most bloody ways in the late 1940s, and it re-emerged in the 1980s. But you know, then just at the time it re-emerged, only a few years later, you have the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, and yeah, I guess we would all say, well, however much we may not believe the Soviet Union was communist or socialist, its fall still had a huge sort of ideological effect and demoralizing effect on all parts of the left, all kinds of parts of the left, and that's certainly true in South Korea. So it really, like, from the moment of it being kind of legalized and rising to the moment when the fall of the Soviet Union happened was only 2 or 3 years, and then it, so you know, yeah. I mean, in various, you know, Trotskyist sort of strands did emerge in South Korea in the early 90s, but you know, none of them have become, you know, none of them have really become large organizations. And what's it? Oh yeah, you were asking at first about the relation to sort of global political trends. Yeah, I haven't really thought this through enough, to be honest. I think that there's clearly something going on globally, and it's much bigger than Trump, and it well predates Trump. It well predates 2016, right? Because before that, you already had Modi. When did Modi come to power? Like more than 10 years ago, right? Before Trump won, you had Abe in Japan, who I think is another kind of sort of blueprint for this kind of populist far right politics. People don't often talk about Japan much, but I think he was. And you had people like Orban and so on. So, you know, there's something going on globally, isn't there? I mean, I said in the talk bit, you know, that I would say there's a kind of it seems like there's a sort of decomposition of the old liberal bourgeois politics, right? Liberal democratic politics. It's for various reasons, both from below and above, it's kind of decomposing in some way. And within that, you're getting these new political forces rising and coming into it. I mean, I guess it must also be related to the sort of transition that we seem to have been going through since the financial crisis of 2008, from the height of kind of neoliberalism and globalization to something else, which whatever that other thing is that we're transitioning into, but that seems to be related to this political transition. That's my own rough sort of thought about it, and I think all of those things have been going on in South Korea as well. You know, the way the economy has shifted into a lower gear of lower growth, you know, where you just can't, people don't live in a society where they can keep looking forward to things getting better, or that their living standards are going to increase. That's just not happening anymore. And at the same time, yeah, I mean, and at the same time, you've got these changes in politics. I don't know whether that's my sort of fairly unformed thoughts on it, but it's quite uncanny just how much you're seeing these similar phenomena. I mean, I was in Brazil at the time that Bolsonaro was elected, and that was really bloody scary, I've got to tell you. I mean, that was like one of the kind of shocking political experiences of my life, meeting people there who were Bolsonaristas, you know, people you think of as pretty normal people, but they were prepared to vote for someone who had the most incredibly frightening policies. Yeah.
Owen, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating talk. Great questions, and thanks very much for illuminating us on a subject that we're not really familiar, don't follow closely enough, perhaps. Watch this space. With that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap up the meeting. I'm going to thank everybody for coming. If it was your first time, please do come back. Next week, not next week, in a fortnight's time, we've got a session that's devoted entirely to the forging communist unity discussions that have been ongoing, involving talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view, the Prometheus editorial board, or rather a section of that, and the Communist Party of Great Britain that produces the Weekly Worker. I think everybody will know that TAS has from its inception set a goal of trying to find allies, people to work with, to help construct a new communist party, a real communist party, one in which all communist, revolutionary, socialist groups should participate, in our opinion. You know, the idea of having a party where whatever our disagreements, our aim is the same. There was no meeting this weekend because various people who represent the organizations had other commitments, but there will be another meeting next weekend, probably on the Sunday, and we'll report back on that to the next Talking About Socialism meeting. If you've read the bulletin that we sent out just a couple of days ago, you'll see that the members meeting of Talking About Socialism agreed to answer favorably the invitation by the CPGB for us to co-host and help to organize the Communist University, which they normally run on their own. So we're doing that now with the Prometheus board. That's the whole of the Prometheus board, as I understand it. And Ed Potts, who spoke at the beginning of the discussion, he's representing TAS in those discussions. So we're looking forward to that. It's at the end of July, beginning of August. So we'll advertise that, and it will be hopefully online if you can't get to the full meeting. And if you've got suggestions about what you think should be included in the agenda for that, then please let us know. I'll finish by this, with this rather. If you've not yet thought about joining TAS, then please have a look at the statement on our website under the About section. We've got a statement there, and if you broadly agree with that and want to help us to find unity with others who want the idea of a mass communist party, then think about joining. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much and good night, and we'll see you in a fortnight's time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.